Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the tier changes for Ultratest 3. So just like with Ultratest 2, they have once again moved a few tanks tiers and rebalanced them. So I'm just going to be going over all of those and those stat changes. So of course there will be a page on my website if you do want to check that out. The full details and everything are on there, and don't forget there is also a separate page for the Ultratest 2 changes, as I am not going to be covering all of those again for the second time in this video or this page, so you can also check out that page, as most of those stats and changes have been kept. But some things to note: all the changes Wargaming has made are not bugs or mistakes, and they are deliberate and intentional. And then, of course, also none of them have been tested, as of course Ultratest 3 hasn't gone live yet. And then, of course, any stat that's not been shown on this page means that it is the same as in the current game. And all stats are shown fully equipped, except for one or two areas which I did mark down as base. So, let me just get into them. So some of the changes that were scrapped from Ultratest 2, which do show up on this page, are BZ-74-1 to tier 10 and Silencer to tier 8. These were both bugs. KV-13 to tier 8 and being a tech tree tank, that was changed because sets have been reworked essentially to no longer need a tier 8 KV-13 in the nation, and you can see there is no KV-13 here, and if you go to find the KV-13 it will show up here as purchasable for gold. So that change has been scrapped. Same thing for the Sherman Firefly becoming a tier 7 for the exact same reason. It was changed back to being a tier 6 and is now a collector vehicle instead of being in the tech tree. Same thing for the M6A2E1 becoming a tech tree tank. That change was scrapped. It has now become a collectible vehicle. And Matilda becoming tier 5, again same thing due to the changes. It has been changed back to being a tier 4 tank. Then of course there are the ones which were kept from Ultratest 2, including the T-34-3 becoming a tier 9, 59 Patton becoming tier 9, Fury becoming tier 7, Borlak becoming tier 7, Churchill 8 becoming tier 7, AC-1 becoming a tier 6 and AC-4 Sentinel becoming a tier 7 respectively. Matilda Black Prince becoming tier 6, VK3001H becoming a tech tree vehicle, and this was of course kept as it does fit in line with the new version of sets. Valentine AT becoming tier 5. There were no stat changes to this tank, unfortunately, which means it is still an absolute garbage vehicle because of the rebalance. And then of course T6E1 becoming tier 5, that was also kept. Of course, if you do want to check out the specific changes for these lower tier tanks, and of course the previous changes to the Patton and T-34-3, you can of course see them on this Ultratest 2 page, as they haven't been detailed in this new one which I have made. But let's get on to the new changes. So firstly, the Kampfpanzer 70. This tank went from being a tier 9 tank to now being tier 10, and for that it has received faster reload, slightly more DPM, ever so slightly more penetration. The aim time, who knows if that actually got better or not, because a lot of the things changed in the game engine and now it kind of calculates it differently, so who knows if that actually became better. But the armour also slightly improved on the turret and significantly improved on the upper plate. On top of this, it did become slightly more mobile with more engine power. So these changes aren't actually that great for the Kampfpanzer. It kind of loses the strengths that it had at tier 9, and those previous strengths now become pretty unimpressive. So of course one of those being the alpha damage. 560 at tier 9 hits pretty hard when you're facing tier 8 tanks and is still good for trading against tier 10s, but at tier 10 it's really not that impressive, and your reload time of 13.5 is also nothing that great either, considering the alpha of 560 is just less than tanks that have 600, 620, 640 alpha. Then on top of this, the fairly good trait of its mobility hasn't really been improved. Its top speed remains the same, its traverse remains the same, it gets slightly more engine power, sure, but you can't really go anywhere with that without increasing the top speed. And of course, while its armour does become better and it gains a lot of hit points going up to 2600 base, it's not the tank type which is really heavily armoured or soaking damage. This is more of an agile heavy tank with a fairly accurate gun with good alpha, and it loses that by becoming a tier 10, where its alpha is now less impressive and it's sort of trying to be this very high hit point tank. So yeah, Kampfpanzer 70 changes definitely not the best, and if it does become a tier 10 like this, I would say it does become slightly weaker than it is currently in tier 9. But next, the TS60. This tank becomes a tier 9 vehicle from being tier 8. Its reload time improves slightly, its damage also improves by 20 per shell and fairly significantly on the HE, and of course the DPM goes up to almost 3.4k. Aim time slightly improves, but again, who knows, and penetration does also slightly improve. On top of this, it does get armour improvements, mainly on the front of the turret and hull, and a top speed improvement. But this tank largely remains the same for a tier 9 vehicle. How it feels and how it plays in tier 8 doesn't really change that much as it's becoming a tier 9. Its penetration in fact gets much worse tier for tier, because the 20mm increase up to tier 9 just causes it to be at heavy tank levels of penetration, whereas in tier 8 it was truly tank destroyer levels of penetration. Couple this with the fact that its mobility hasn't been improved, it is still unbelievably slow with horrible traverse speed, and the armour, while becoming better for tier 9, again it's moved up a whole tier, it should become better. So this tank, again, it's still basically the same tier 60 you knew in tier 8, just adjusted to be the same gameplay in tier 9. So nothing impressive for that tank either. Next, the Keiler. This also becomes a tier 9 vehicle. Its reload time reduces fairly significantly, alpha damage goes up by 10 and a nice 30 on HE, DPM increases by almost, well, 400, and aim time, again, who knows. Penetration, it does go up, not by a massive amount, but it's still pretty usable for tier 9, and of course the armour does also increase. On top of this, it does receive extra hit points, which I did forget to mention for the TS60. That's wrong, it has 1700, but ignore that, that's a typo. But for the Keiler it is 1850, moving up to 2200, and of course 20 extra horsepower. So the Keiler, again, just like the TS60, is basically the same tank it was in tier 8 moved up to tier 9. Its penetration much less impressive in tier 9 than when it was at tier 8, where it was truly pretty good. Same thing for the alpha damage, 350 in tier 8 was pretty nice, but 360 in tier 9 is on the lower end now, and it's not really that impressive. But the gameplay overall of this tank does seem to remain roughly the same, as the traits of the vehicle have largely remained unchanged. It's still a fairly armoured vehicle which has decent enough top speed and pretty good gun for what it is. Though of course I think Wargaming could still adjust this tank to be a little bit better in terms of its alpha damage or penetration, as those were kind of the traits this tank had in tier 8 which were pretty enjoyable about this vehicle, but it is somewhat compensating on as it moves to tier 9. So the next tank, the Kanonenjagdpanzer, receiving pretty similar changes, again moving from tier 8 to tier 9, receiving better reload, better alpha damage, faster, well, higher DPM, better penetration, slightly, not by much. Its HP and of course its armour do increase, that HP being very useful for a tier 9, and then the armour not being so significant as this tank is essentially paper anyway. Speed does also increase, and in this case it's pretty significant. 3 kilometers tops forward speed is indeed very nice, and extra 40 horsepower, again pretty nice for a fast tank destroyer. However, for what this tank is, these are not that impressive changes. 3.2k DPM in tier 9. For a tank destroyer, it's certainly not impressive. In fact, tier 10 mediums have very similar alpha damage and slightly better DPM than this tank does, meaning really it's not that great, as its alpha damage isn't the best for trading, and it doesn't either have the DPM for out DPMing higher tier opponents. And of course, penetration, not impressive for a tank destroyer if you do consider things just like the TS60. The only thing that is really nice about this is that you can use the new equipment and get up to 61 top speed and have 24.6 horsepower per ton, which does make you really very quick, sort of almost like a tier 9 version of the E25. However, of course, the issue remains, your DPM and alpha damage are not that impressive. 360 for a tank destroyer, definitely not winning any awards. Next, the T2020. So, this tank, it's moved from tier 8 to tier 9. Reload time decreases by 1.8 seconds, DPM does increase pretty significantly, aim time decreases technically, and penetration also increases just like the other tanks. Its HP goes up by a decent amount, and well, still not the best for tier 9, but still decent. And its engine power does also increase by 50. However, the T2020 is the first of these tanks which truly just sucks out of the new rebalances. It is terrible. Main reason being, its armor in tier 8, it's pretty decent, but move it up to tier 9 without buffing it at all, which is what Wargaming has done, and then you have problems, and it is just complete paper. I've been playing this tank a few games in the bot matchmaking, and let me tell you, if the bots can just pen right through your upper plate when you're angling, when you're angling correctly, then you do have some issues, because the bots are not spamming premium ammo, they're not aiming carefully, they're kind of just auto-aiming at your tank, and they're going through without any issues. And of course that will be because you have a tier 8 armor profile in tier 9 without any buffs at all. So T2020 definitely has some problems because its alpha damage isn't impressive either for its reload time, especially when you look at a tank like the IS-8, and on top of this, its mobility is still pretty bad. So bad armor, bad gun, bad mobility, this tank just absolutely sucks as a tier 9 vehicle. Next, the Vickers MBT, same thing, moving from tier 8 to tier 9, reload time improves slightly, alpha damage improves slightly, and its DPM of course does improve, and it gets better aim time? I'm not sure if this is correct, because I don't think the Vickers MBT has 3.9 seconds of aim time in the regular game, so you can ignore that for the moment. And it does of course get better penetration to be a tier 9 vehicle. On top of this, extra hit points and slightly better mobility. However, just like the T2020, this tank didn't get any armor adjustments moving to tier 9, but considering it is the Vickers MBT, that's not the worst thing in the world. This tank does have a tier 9 armor profile already while it is at tier 8. The thing that's the issue with the Vickers MBT is that 320 alpha in tier 8 is very nice, very good for a medium tank, especially one that has armor and 8 degrees of gun depression. Its DPM at tier 8 isn't the biggest issue, because having a slow reload when you have 320 alpha means you can still trade against enemies. However, you move it up to tier 9, keeping a pretty bad reload time, that alpha damage only increases by 10, and then you combine that with a non-buffed armor profile and your mobility doesn't get insanely better, you get a pretty disappointing vehicle. This tank has low alpha, it has fairly unimpressive penetration considering tier 9 standards, and its DPM just is not good. It's kind of like, if you think of the old Eric Concept 1 before its buff, it's kind of like that, except with even less alpha. So certainly not impressive for the Vickers MBT. I'll say this is more usable than the T2020, of course, playing against bots, so who knows how true that is. But 330 Alpha in Tier 9, not impressive. 7.9 second reload in Tier 9, not impressive. This tank should be reloading much faster or have at least 350 Alpha. Remember, at Tier 9 you've got tanks like the Centurion 7-1, Type 61, the T-54, which all have 350 or 330 Alpha with faster reloads, and this just certainly is not impressive at all. Next, 59 Pattern and T-34-3, those are from Ultratest 2. You can check out the other video I did for those tanks. The Somua SM is the next vehicle. This tank, same thing, moving to Tier 9. Reload time gets much better by, well, 3 seconds. Its damage also gets much better by 40, which is great. Its DPM gets significantly better by, well, 600 almost. And then, of course, its aim time also improves. And this is an actual aim time improvement because the Somua SM does notoriously have horrendous base aim time, and it is noticeably improved in this update. Penetration also gets much better, and of course armor does also improve by a pretty significant amount on the hull and turret. On top of this, engine power improves and its hard terrain resistance does get better. However, that does mean that your medium terrain traverse speed does worsen. However, talking about these changes for the Somua SM, it is actually pretty nice. The Somua sucks in Tier 8 for a few reasons. It's not a bad tank overall, but it's really just irritating to play because it has a 23-second reload, which is horrendous. Its gun is horribly inaccurate and slow aiming, and then its armor just isn't impressive with this big cupola on the top. So moving to Tier 9, its gun gets noticeably more usable. In fact, it's pretty decent, 350 Alpha with a 3-second intraclip. And that's sort of like a K91, except with faster intraclip reload for slower magazine reload. It keeps the nice 10 gun depression, its mobility is still pretty good, and its armor has been adjusted for Tier 9. It's not gotten better tier for tier, in fact its turret may even be slightly weaker, however it does still have good hull armor to bounce shots from, well, players who don't aim, and its turret is still fairly troll. So, just like the TS60, the Keiler, this tank essentially remains the same in terms of gameplay. Its gun just isn't quite as annoying to use, as it does reload faster, have better alpha damage, and aim faster, which is certainly a nice improvement for the vehicle in terms of playability. And I forgot to mention, HP also improved. Next, the Skoda T27. This tank gets a few nice buffs, 1 second off the magazine reload, extra alpha for, well, its autoloader, much more DPM, of course being a Tier 9. Ignore this aim time thing, I copy pasted it from the Somua, and its penetration does also improve. On top of this, its armor gets slightly better, but that doesn't really do too much, it just stops a few HE shells in some situations, and of course an extra 200 hit points. On top of this, slightly better mobility and top speed. So, the Skoda T27, these are actually quite nice changes for this tank. Again, just like the Somua, the Keiler and the TS60, the gameplay of this tank doesn't change. It's basically the Tier 8 Skoda moved up to Tier 9 with the same characteristics, same gameplay, same traits, same everything. It's just been balanced to be a Tier 9 vehicle. But again, Skoda in Tier 8 is a very nice tank, and it is very enjoyable in terms of how it plays, and of course with the new equipment in Reforged you can utilise that improved top speed and this equipment to get up to a 55 top speed. However, the tank essentially keeps its same fast intraclip, fast aim time, good accuracy, and just a very nice overall gun for Tier 9. And it's good to see that unlike the Vickers and the T2020, they didn't ruin one of these more unique vehicles, and the Skoda certainly is that in both Tier 8 and 9. And finally, the Tornvagn, arguably the best out of all of the changes that Wargaming has done for the tier changes. So let's look at it. Tier 8 to tier 9, of course, it goes from being a cyclic gun to an auto reloader. The first shell has a 14-second reload, the second shell has a 10-second reload, and the third shell has a 7-second reload. Intraclip is 2.73 seconds, which is noticeably faster than other auto reloader guns, like the Contracaro 1 Mark II, for example, has 3.53, and I believe the Emil 2 also has 3.53. 2.73, very much like the Kranvagn, but in tier 9. On top of this, better DPM, of course. This is looking at your optimal DPM for the Tornvagn. Better aim time, which is certainly very nice considering in tier 8 that gun does aim quite slowly. And of course, better penetration. 290 on APCR isn't anything super amazing, but considering it is APCR and it doesn't have, well, it does normalize and go through spaced armor unlike heat, 290 is still usable. It's definitely on the lower end, but it is still usable. Contrary to the T2020's 290 on heat, which I completely forgot to mention, but again, T2020 sucks in tier 9, so yeah. Next, the turret does improve. Not like it needed it, but it does improve. Upper plate does also improve. Turret side and hull side both improve, and the hull side is actually pretty important on this tank. 50 means that 105mm guns can HEU. 60 though means that tanks have to have basically 122 or 130mm guns to HEU. It takes out a very large portion of the guns that can easily HE your hull side, and that 10mm armor buff does actually make a very nice difference. HP improves to 2100, which is one of the lower improvements for tier 9 heavy. However, considering how nice this tank's gun is in terms of its burst damage, this is actually perfectly alright. However, again, remember, going from a single shotgun to a very potent autoloader with, well, 1200 damage burst in a fairly short time is going to be pretty formidable, considering you are still facing tier 8 tanks in some of your battles, and then going up against tier 10s like the Kranvagn, which your gun really rivals pretty closely, just with a longer reload. So definitely out of all of these changes, I'd say personally for me the Tornvagn is the most exciting change out of all of them, and it is really a pretty good one. It may be a bit strong, of course Wargaming would have to work on that, but this is the way to go in terms of if you're going to change a tank, as it does make it just a lot more interesting from its old version, and I would hopefully like to see something like that happen for the T2020, which is just a complete joke for how they have gone around balancing that for now. Of course, there are still some leftover changes from tier 10 rebalance, which, again, they're leftovers from an older patch, so I'm not going to talk about them, but I did discuss them in the other page and on a different video. But that is it for the tier changes in Ultratest 3, at least the most significant ones. Mainly just moving a bunch of tier 8 tanks to tier 9, many of them, really, their gameplay doesn't change too much, but then, for a few of them, it does become either significantly worse or a fair bit better. And then finally the last one, Kampfpanzer 70, moving to tier 10, a slight shadow nerf on its changes, but oh well. But yeah, that is it for the changes in Ultratest 3 to tank tiers. Thank you all for watching.